Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Billy, and I am the founder and organizer and basically sole person of Bookstore Romance Day. Thank you all so much for joining us. I put this event together because when I read Kelly's The Book of Love, there is a character, Maryanne Gorch, who was a romance author who got her start in the 70s and 80s. And it sparked something in me. And then I got to her author's note at the end, and she talked about having consulted with Steve on the history of Black women in the romance genre. And pieces started falling into place. So I started thinking about this, and somehow the fates were very kind and allowed it to happen. So welcome, everyone. If you have questions for any of our panelists, please drop them in the Q&A. Do not put them in the chat. They will get lost. But please use the chat to talk amongst yourselves. If you have any questions for me, I will be throwing some links into the chat for you to order books, some resources that Steve has kindly put together for us. And that's about all of my little housekeeping. So I would like to introduce you to your panel. We have Steve Ammidown, who is a romance historian and will be serving as our moderator today. Kelly Link, who wrote The Book of Love, which inspired this whole event. And two authors who really probably need no introduction, absolute legends in the field, Beverly Jenkins and Sandra Kitt. And I will turn it over to Steve now. And thank you all again for joining us.
Hi, everyone. Two quick housekeeping businesses. I'd like to have everyone wish Billy a happy birthday. It's her birthday today. And I also want to make sure that Billy drops the link to the Bookstore Romance Day GoFundMe in the chat so that everyone can contribute. This is a totally free event, as are the events in August, and they need financial support as much as anything. So anyways, I want to say hi to the panel. Welcome, friends. It's so good to see you all. Yeah. Kelly, since you were sort of the impetus for all of us coming together, I thought maybe if you wanted to start off by talking a little bit about the Book of Love and some of the inspiration, and then we can go from there.
I will do. I want to ask first, can everybody see us at the moment? I saw for a minute, it looked like, oh, good. It looks like yes. So I will keep this very brief. I am primarily a short story writer. This is my first novel. It's called The Book of Love. And because I'm not primarily a novelist, I figured I would throw in everything that I love. I love coming of age stories. I like big magical novels, novels with a lot of magic in it. And I love romance novels. And so when I began to think about this, I thought I'm going to put all of these things into Book of Love, and we'll see how it works. One of the characters in the novel is a writer, Maryanne Gorch, who has had an enormously successful career for many decades under the name Caitlin Hightower. She is Black. She began publishing at a moment when romance was mostly, especially historical romance, was mostly a white genre. And so she writes about a historical Scottish character, Lavender Glass. These books are enormously popular, and although she does write other kinds of romance over the course of her life, she also continues to return to the story of Lavender Glass. And so this is a very short piece from a section from her point of view. And I should say in this section, the time is skipping around a little bit. She is thinking about her career. Here Maryanne is on her lunch break, sitting on a bench on the bank of the Tennessee River. She reads romance novels. She likes the happy endings. Some of them are so bad that she thinks I could write a better book than this, but even the bad ones are reliable in the end. Love conquers all, hand in hand. She is a fast reader. She is a fast writer. In 42 years, she writes 73 books. She writes every day, 10 pages every day. Every second book is a book about Lavender Glass. And later she moves on to Lavender Glass's beautiful daughters. Maryanne is in labor. In the 21st hour, they cut her open and take Kara out. Sometimes when she is writing, she reaches down and touches the little pucker where a doctor closed her up. Time is a row of small and hateful stitches. No one slips through that door once it has been shut. Here Maryanne is typing the first sentence of the first Lavender Glass novel on the Selectric. I would die for love, Lavender Glass thought, looking down at the sea. Maryanne Gorch has never seen the sea. She drives east until she comes to the Atlantic Ocean, and then she drives north until she finds a house on a cliff above the ocean. Gulls nest in the cliffs below her house. One day, she will have a rose garden here below the pine trees. She and Kara move into the house before there is even furniture. They have sleeping bags. Kara has a toy ukulele. Every weekend, Maryanne rides the Chattanooga incline to the top of Lookout Mountain and then walks down the trails in the Chickamauga National Park. She loves high places. The name of the town is Love's End. I love love. The ending is always happy. When Maryanne writes, she is not unhappy. Her mother says, who will ever buy a romance novel by a Black girl? They won't know I'm Black, Maryanne says. She submits the manuscript under the name Caitlin Hightower. Who wants to read a romance novel written by someone named Gorch? Write what you know. Well, fine. A thing that Maryanne knows is romance novels. Terrible things happen at the start and in the middle, but the ending is always happy. And I'll stop.
I was lucky enough, as Billy mentioned, to read the Book of Love last year, and it was a singular experience of sort of all these time jumps, and you feel like it's this book that almost picks you up in a whirlpool of words and emotions and feelings. It's just a delightful book, and I do highly recommend it to everybody.
Sounds great. Thank
You know,
you.
we actually have a question in the Q&A that I think sort of ties into all this, Kelly. So what made you decide to have Maryanne be Black and to be part of the romance world in that way?
Well, honestly, part of it always comes down for a writer to conservation of characters. That when you begin to think about the people who are sort of the main characters of the book, you also then think about their families, their friends, and one of the characters in the book, Mo Gorch, he is a Black teenager, and I knew that he lived up on a house above the town of Love's End. And I knew that I wanted somebody in the book to be a writer of romance novels. And I realized that I had space there for his grandmother, Maryanne. And, I have always been interested in the ways in which, as a reader and as a writer, it's possible to love genres and stories that do not love you back. That you make space for yourself. And one of the ways that you do that is by writing, but one of the ways that you do that is through imagination, that you are able to take something which was not published for you, and you are still able to make a space to see yourself reflected in that. And there are a lot of secrets in this book. And so it seemed to me that Maryanne Gorch was a place where somebody who had sort of in some ways a second personality, this writer that she constructed when she was first writing these novels. And also that I would be able to use her as sort of a guiding just as a point of view that would serve as a guide point throughout the novel, that I would imagine the kind of happy endings and the kind of the pleasures of the romance novel all the way through, that I would think, what kind of solution would she have to this kind of outrageous situation that I've created? How would she write this story, and sort of work with that in mind?
Great.
That's really excellent. Yeah, and I think Maryanne plays this really interesting role of sort of popping in and out, literally and figuratively, within Mo's life. And yeah, I love her as a character. And I think, one of the interesting things is you talked about Maryanne getting her start in the 70s and 80s. And we sort of think about Black romance authors as being a fairly recent phenomenon. But the more that we sort of dig, and Bev and I have done some digging in this, there really is a history here of these authors being there and telling these love stories. And I wondered, Bev, you wrote this excellent chapter in the book Black Love Matters, which I think you have a copy right there.
Yes, I do.
You want to show the people? It's a tremendous collection of essays. And I wonder if you could maybe take us back to some of those early names of, women and men who were writing romance and love stories within a structure that didn't really welcome them in a lot of ways.
Yeah. The first name that jumped out at me and surprised me was Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, abolitionist, womanist, one of the first Black women to be published poem-wise, better known for her iconic poem, Bury Me in a Free Land. And she wrote Iola Leroy in 1892. She was 67 years old. So she had this huge, body of work tied to abolition. And then she comes up with a romance novel. And as a writer, we also always get these questions about if you could invite somebody to a dinner, living or dead, who would it be? And it would be her, because I want to know what motivated you to write a romance novel, and not necessarily at her age, but why? So she was followed by Pauline Hopkins, and this was at a time when America was sort of changing for African Americans. It was after the gutting of Reconstruction, and hope was still there, and hope is part of romance. But after Plessy versus Ferguson and all the other, wrong-headed things by the Supreme Court, hope sort of died. And for a long time, there was no romance because there was no hope. So I don't know how long you want me to talk about this, but they are they are sort of the foremothers, Pauline Hopkins. And the interesting thing too about Iola Leroy is that there's a happy ending. The story is a mess. I think the critics really panned it. The story's about a light-skinned Black woman who's got blue eyes. Her father is a planter. She and her mother are sold into slavery, and it's just, all over the place. But she ends up marrying a Black doctor and working for the community. And there's an HEA at the end of it. So that in itself has the hope that maybe was not there for the race in general. So, and then we have Pittsburgh Courier, the newspaper, one of the longest living. There are tons of Black newspapers in the 19th century and early 20th, and they ran a series called The Dark Knight, Knight, and it was about a young Black man from Montana who comes east, marries the lovely Lila Durant in Chicago, and it's their adventures and their love, and it sort of broke stereotypes in the sense of not only looking at Black love, but looking at Black people who were homesteading in Montana, which is where he was from, and dealing with a level of Black society that had wealth. So I'm going to shut up now and let someone else speak.
Well, and I think that, there were other names. I know I was going through Anne Ellen Shockley's bibliographic work, and she talks about a woman named Amelia E. Johnson, who was a daughter of a slave owner and a slave, very light-skinned, but was really the first Black woman to write a novel, but it had white characters.
Yeah.
And then I think that was maybe 2 years before Frances Ellen Watkins Harper. So, there's this sort of wide range, and you had people like Frank Yerby who were writing, these fantastical stories, and, correct me if I'm wrong, but he wrote literally any kind of era. When you because didn't he wrote some like medieval stories and some more modern tales and things. So there are authors that were really in there. And then we get into sort of the 1960s, and in 1969, actually I have it right here, Ruby Saunders, who was a magazine editor in New York, she was the editor of Calling All Girls, which would later become Young Miss, which would later become YM. But she writes 4 romance novels. They're nurse novels, so they're sort of as much about nursing as about romance. And I think these are really interesting because they have happily for nows.
Yeah.
At the end of each book, she is dating a different man, and she is happily dating him, but like it's clear that's marriage is not on the cards for her. She wants to keep on going. So I think these are, there's some really interesting sort of moments. And then as you go into the 70s, Anne Ellen Shockley starts writing interracial lesbian novels, which is groundbreaking in and of itself.
Right.
Anne Ellen Shockley, who was a librarian and archivist, so a woman after my own heart, at Fisk University, and sort of created their archives, I think, from whole cloth. I think she was sort of their initial archivist. And she's still around as far as I know. She is in her 90s. So she's up there with Vivian Stevens and still kicking and still causing trouble. So, that kind of brings me to you in the 80s, Sandra. So you came along during sort of these early romance war eras of the 80s. And I wondered if you could maybe talk about some of those early days and some of those folks who were maybe behind the scenes. So, Vivian Stevens, Veronica Mixon, some of those folks. Just talk about how you got started as a writer.
Well, I think I have to make it clear that from the beginning, it had not been my intention to be a writer or to write necessarily romance. I was an absolute voracious reader as a child, and it was, not unusual for me to do 10 books in a week, return them to the library, take 10 out, and just keep going. It was also during a time when there was no filter on what I was reading. So I didn't go into my local library and have the librarian say, you have to go into this section because it's for children, or, YA, and you can't go over here. I just roamed around picking out things on the shelf that looked interesting. And if I got into a story that I didn't quite understand, a little bit too much for me, I just didn't continue to read it. But I loved reading. And of course, I went the whole route as a middle school student and then high school with the romance novels, which were all the Mills and Boones, i.e. Harlequin, because that's, all that was there. And it absolutely did not trouble me that I was reading love stories about white people, white couples, as opposed to seeing any at all with Black characters. The thing that fascinated me first and foremost about reading the romance novels was that it was an indoctrination into the relationship between men and women. How do they come together? Where does the spark come from? If it's combative at the very beginning, where does that come from? And at what point does it turn to something else of the heart, love? That fascinated me more than anything else. And so I was learning quite a bit as an adolescent and teenager about what male-female love should look like because of the happy ending that was expected of the story. I want to know how they got there. And I was interested in the characters. So my stories are very much character-driven. I want to know about motivation and where it comes from and where do they begin to arc and things change for them. The first book that I wrote, which eventually became The Color of Love, was written in 1980. I knew nothing about the publishing field. I knew nothing about romances beyond what I was reading from Harlequin. I didn't know anything. I didn't know how to get started with any of that. But I came up with an idea for a book pretty quickly, based on an incident that happened to me during my lunch break managing a library at the Museum of Natural History in New York. But the incident literally sparked an idea for a story, and it came to me fully formed. It was pretty magical. And I went home that night and began writing. Didn't tell anyone what I was doing because I didn't know what I was doing. And in 6 weeks, 6 or 7 weeks, I had a 100,000 word book, a manuscript. And the thing about having written it was I gave no thought to getting it published. If it could be published, I was writing to entertain myself. My motivation was to see, could I write this story that came to me full-fledged and from beginning to end and work it through and be happy with it. However, when I was about halfway through with it, I came up with another idea for another book and wrote that, finished it, and then started a third book. So I had 3 completed novels before I ever thought, wow, something's going on here. You know, I can barely get through one book where I'm getting ideas for more. So clearly, you know, what if some of this could actually be published? So enter, so to speak, Vivian Stevens. At the time, Harlequin had decided that they were going to start an American romance line where the stories were written by American women for an American audience because they could see the numbers in terms of sales and where the sales were coming from, that there was a huge American audience for romance novels. And so it was the American romance line that Vivian Stevens was charged with developing and setting up in New York, in the United States, because as you know, Harlequin is a Canadian line. And there was an article in the New York Times about this editor who was opening up this office. And I made a cold call to her. And I said, I just see that you're starting a line for Harlequin. I don't know anything about publishing. I'm not sure I know what I'm doing, but I've written a book that I think is really wonderful. And I think that you might be interested in it. And she said, why don't you come in and talk to me? And they were setting up offices in Manhattan on 2nd Avenue. And when I went into her office, they were so new that they had no furniture. They had a couple of desks and chair. She had no staff. There was just Vivian. And this huge, huge space, most of which was dark. And she sat down with me for 2 solid hours and gave me a tutorial on what her line of publishing was all about, what her background was, who she had been publishing. And I mean, you know, you're talking Barbara Delinsky, Jane Ann Krantz, Sandra Brown. They came out of Vivian's work with her earlier line. So at the end of the 2 hours, she said, you said that you've written a couple of books. Why don't you just take 2 of the 3 and send them to me and let me take a look at them? And that's what I did. As soon as I got home, I packaged them up, and we're talking manuscripts. We're not talking discs yet. I mean, they didn't even have computers. This is 1980, 1981, 82. Yeah. So this was like the birth of everything. Mm-hmm. And she called me 10 days later to say she was buying 2 of the 3 books. And that's how it happened. I got picked up that quickly because it was Vivian. And I've been publishing pretty normally ever since then. We're talking 40 years, a little bit more than 40 years. One of the things that she said to me that really resonated was that she wanted to use her position to begin to introduce Black writers into the genre and into publishing. That was her mission. That was her goal. And at that point, I knew that her sister, Barbara, had written a book. And she had also tapped into Elsie Washington, who was a journalist, to write a book. And I remember Elsie telling me several years later, after she wrote Entwined Destinies, that she never wanted to do it because, you know, she was not a romance writer. She was a journalist. But when Vivian calls, you come and you do the best you can. So they were basically the guinea pigs, the forerunners for what Vivian had in mind. And then I came along with 2 or 3 finished books, which she picked up almost immediately. At the same time, you had Veronica Mixon, who was an editor at an imprint at Doubleday. It was the Starlight series. And the Starlight series were romances that were intended to be promoted and marketed to high school readers, high school girls. And so that's where Veronica was getting her training. But so that's how it happened. Now, the thing is this, I never started out to be a romance writer. As I said, I didn't start out to be a writer. And one of the books that I showed Vivian was that first manuscript, The Color of Love, which that wasn't the title at the time, but what it became. And she said, this is more than I want for my story. She said, this is really a much bigger, much more complex books than what I'm looking for in the genre. And at that time, historically, if you were a female writer and you were writing a story that had in any way a love story or a romance in it, bam, you were a romance writer. And bam, your options were Harlequin. And Doubleday, perhaps. It was a few years before all of these other main traditional publishing houses began to pick up on the fact that these genre books were selling like crazy. And to this day, the sales of genre, romance, women's fiction, fantasy books still outsell any other level of fiction in this country or any other book at all. The romance books lead in terms of sales. So they began to realize that they were onto something. I began to learn as I worked with Vivian about how all of this was developing and how I became an integral part of it. I know I'm going on a little bit, but
no, go on, please.
She was very clear in what she wanted. When she offered me a contract, a 2-book contract, the first book that came out was Rites of Spring, in which the main characters were white, and then came Adam and Eva, in which the main characters were Black. And one of the things she told me when we were working on Adam and Eva was that Harlequin, when they found out that the writer of that book was African American, they wanted to cancel the contract. They didn't want me, and they didn't want the book for the same reason. And basically, Vivian went to the mat for me. She said, no, I bought this book. You put me in charge of this line, and this book is going to get published. So she was incredibly strong. She knew what she wanted, and she had been so hugely successful with her line at before the Harlequin line at Doubleday, that they just sort of caved in, and and the book did come out. Now, what was ironic about that was that Adam and Eva, in terms of this history of the American romance line for Harlequin, became one of their classics. Because it was the first Black story by a Black writer, it gained that kind of notoriety. But then what also happened afterwards was anything else I gave Harlequin that had that had Black characters in it, they wouldn't buy. And I found that kind of interesting. I was a little bit either I was really kind of naive about the whole industry and a little bit about the racism because I didn't have that kind of upbringing. But I've always considered myself a switch hitter as a writer, and that was certainly true when I first got started. And any of you guys out there who are a sports fan know what I mean about being a switch hitter. Well, in terms of being a writer, that's exactly what I was. And by that, I meant if an idea came from me and the characters were Black, that's what I wrote. But if the idea came to me and the characters were white, that's what I wrote. I didn't think there was going to be a difference submitting these two love stories to Harlequin. It's just one it's just two different ethnicities. But there was. They didn't want the Black stories. So I very quickly figured out how to get around that by creating secondary characters in my white novels that were Black, so that I can get them into the story. You put them in there, and they have relationships, and they are important pivotal characters. So that went on. And then the Black stories that I had written that I thought that I could sell to Harlequin, I sold to Veronica Mixon. I sold one to her. I sold one to Letitia, last name.
Letitia
Odyssey.
Peoples.
Thank you, Peoples.
Yes.
Yeah, Odyssey.
Odyssey books. Yep.
Right. Sold one to her. So those, I was writing Black stories. They just were going someplace else, And then I got to 1993, and Harlequin decided to do an anthology around Thanksgiving. And they asked me to be one of the writers. And then they asked me to make the characters interracial. So we jumped from the pot into, the frying pan into the stove, from not wanting these certain kind of stories to saying, could you give us an interracial story? And I'm thinking, okay. It was a tremendous educational trajectory for me, and very, very important for the way I gained my knowledge of the industry and the players and what was going on. And the thing also was they didn't expect me to last. They thought it was a fluke that I came out with Rites of Spring and Love Everlasting and Adam and Eve. They said, this is just a fluke. She's not gonna make it. And by 1993, that was like my 10th book. So clearly something was going on. Yeah.
Yeah.
Very interesting beginning. And I have to give Vivian her due.
Yeah.
She knew what she wanted. She was fighting for it. She was my first editor. And so I was very fortunate to be, in that regard, the right place at the right time.
With the talent.
Oh, thank you.
With the talent. Absolutely.
Thank you, Bev. Thank you very much.
Well, and that actually gives us a chance to segue slightly to one side, because Bev, you had your own interactions with Vivian Stevens in your journey to publishing Night Song, which was your first book, which came out in 19...
first editor. My first agent.
Oh, so I wonder if you could just sort of walk us through how that came to be.
Like Sandra, I had no intentions of being a writer. My dream was to work in a library. That's what I was doing. I didn't need anything else in my life. And I've told this story often of my colleague at work who had gotten published. And I told her about this manuscript I was working on, like Sandra, for me, because, the market was closed to us. And I'm writing, what would eventually become Night Song. And I wrote on this book for 10 years. So after being harassed by Laverne at work to see the manuscript, and just to shut her up, I brought it in. She looked at it. She said, you need to get this published. And I'm like, where? And I cannot tell you how I found Vivian. I don't know if it was through Romantic Times or what, but some kind of way, I got hold of her address, and I sent the manuscript to her in all of its raggediness. And she called me. I was working at the reference desk for Park Davis Pharmaceuticals. And she called me maybe a week later saying she wanted to represent me. She had gotten out of publishing. She was just doing the lit agent thing. And it took us a while to get it published. Because in publishing's mind, a 19th century story starring Black people should have been about slavery. You know, it should not have been about free Black people living in a small town on the plains of Kansas. They were like, what the hell is this? What are we supposed to do with this, right?
Right.
And in the meantime, she's getting tons and tons of rejections. And a lot of them she did not tell me about, which was fine with me. I mean, probably if I had been set on getting published, this would have broken my heart. But I had my dream job. I'm working in the library. I could give a care about it, you know, a bad whatever. So, but she sold it. And ironically enough, she sold it to the woman who used to be her assistant at Dell. Oh God, the name, Ellen Edwards.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Ellen Edwards.
Yeah.
And Ellen called her and said, do you have anybody that Avon could publish? Because Walter Zacharias was getting ready to start Arabesque, and Avon, being the #1 house, did not want to get left behind. So Vivian said, well, yes, I've got this little lady in Michigan, blah, blah, blah. So sent it in June of 1993, was published in 94. And Vivian taught me how to act, you know, how to compose myself. We didn't talk too much about the writing, but we talked about relationship with readers, you know, all of the of who I am in dealing with my readers and in dealing with, you know, publishing houses and all of that was from Vivian, because like Sandra, I had no clue.
Right. Yeah.
No clue, none, zero.
None.
You know, I'm just a little Black girl in Detroit. You know, I don't know nothing about none of that.
Happy in the library.
Right. Yeah. You know, I can tell you where to find a book, but you know, so to have her for my first 2 books was the foundation that I needed to make this career 30 years, you know. So, and I got to meet her for the very first time in person. Couple years, well, the last RWA in Dallas. So we had not met. It'd been all phone calls, and like Sandra said, this was before computers, so you know, it was all you know, dial up and you know, home phone and landline, and you know, and all of that. So
Right.
but she's still alive and kicking, and you know, somebody told me recently that there might be a documentary in the works for her, which would be you know, fabulous.
That would be fabulous. Yeah.
Yeah, it would be fabulous. But yeah, her intention was to, you know, I know she was close to Frances and some of the other early.
Frances Gray.
And Donna.
And Laura Parker, who was, because Laura was from Texas also.
Yeah. So, you know, romance, and not just Black romance, would not be what it is today were it not for Vivian Stevens. You know, she created American romance.
One of the things I admired about her, and I said this to her, and it remains true even today, she was the only editor that I ever knew or worked with who had a very clear idea of what she thought a romance was. And what it should be in a book for readers. She just was very firm on what that needed to be. And when she told me, you know, her feelings about it, it resonated, and it still does. And I remember that I have never met another, and I've had some good editors, but she was so clear and so firm on what a romance should be and what should be in it to be
Yeah.
appealing.
Yeah.
And
Longing looks. She
I'm
said,
sorry?
Longing looks. She said longing
Right.
looks. And there was another phrase that she used.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't remember, but yeah.
But what she was into the emotionality of it,
Right. Yes.
which is very much how I write. In that it's, we all know how it's done, between
Right,
her
yeah.
and him. We know all of the steps, but that's not what romance is. It's the
Right.
feelings that
Yeah.
come behind it. How do you feel?
Yeah.
When
the emotion
he-
tied to it. Yeah.
Right. It's very tactile. What does your skin feel like? What does it feel like
Right.
when someone strokes you? That's, for her, is what demonstrates romance. And so I really appreciated the fact that, and look how successful she was with Dell.
Right. Yeah.
So yeah, she was absolutely right up there at the top.
Yeah. She said she would go into the stores when romance first started selling and talk to readers and
Oh.
ask them, why are you buying these books? And they would tell her because of this reason or that reason or that reason. She said, and she would take that back and just, resonate within herself.
Right.
To give to her authors. So
Right.
just quite the force of nature still.
Yeah.
Quite the force of nature.
And I think, we talk a lot about, or I talk a lot about, I shouldn't say we, but when we talk about Del Candlelight and what Vivian did there, the word that gets thrown around a lot is increased sensuality.
Yes.
And
Yes.
and I think, what's really important is that Vivian, from talking with her and reading interviews and things, like, she didn't want a dirty book. That wasn't what she was after.
No.
She was after the, like Sandra was saying, the sort of tactile part of it.
Right.
Yeah.
part that,
sensuality.
the part that gets you there, right?
Yeah.
Like the
Yeah.
the feeling and
Right.
what gets you to the bedroom door.
Yeah.
And then, after it could be sort of hinted at later. And I think
Right.
that's really interesting because, especially for 1980 and 1981, that was just a huge push.
Yeah.
In a way that we sort of we think, oh, it must have been really dirty, but no, it really wasn't. That's
Yeah.
you
like
know,
No,
somebody said
the
here-
early historicals were, I wouldn't even call them dirty. I think of Rosemary Rogers
Sure.
and, and they were considered sort of the early soft porn, but they were also historicals.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Somebody mentioned the Journal of Popular Romance Studies. Julie did an interview with Vivian, and if you have not availed yourself of that, treat yourself to that because she's just so full of wisdom and
Yeah.
all of that. It's a great interview. Great
If
interview.
if you are not subscribed to the Black Romance podcast, in which you will find two of our guests, Beverly and Sandra both did early episodes, and Vivian did a two-part episode, which does not surprise me, having spent time with Vivian,
Right.
that she just kept going.
Yes.
And it was one of those things where I was listening to it and just taking in everything she was saying and how she was talking about the genre and her work. Really fascinating, and definitely recommend people check that out. If this conversation is at all interesting to you, those conversations are incredible. So, one of the things that, Sandra, I had one question for you, just to go back to sort of you getting started. You mentioned The Color of Love was finally published by Signet, right?
That's correct. Yeah. Penguin Putnam.
Who was do you remember who the editor was then?
Yes.
'Cause I feel like
Jennifer
they need a
Enderlin.
shout out. Who was it?
Jennifer Enderlin,
Okay.
who went on to become a vice president of, the whole line. She got out of editing, but she was a very good editor. But she was the one who picked it up and gave me multiple book contracts. I had 3 with Penguin Putnam, but the first book to launch that line, that run for me, was The Color of Love. And I remember when I was trying to push it on my own, again, not knowing editors or anything, I just, as a librarian, I did the research, who are the people that I need to try to reach out to, and tried contacting them. And it was very gratifying for me, an inexperienced writer at the very beginning, for them to say, this is really a great story and we don't know what to do with it. Because for that time, it was considered a taboo story. It was interracial. It was contemporary. It had multiple points of view, which they tell you, you do not do this in romance. And I broke all the rules. I broke all of them. And so I love the fact that they thought it was a good story, because I certainly always believed in it. But it did take me a full 15 years to get that book published. And it was Jennifer Enderlin at Signet.
And you went on to do two collections at Signet as well, with Anita Richmond Bunkley and Eva Rutland.
Yes,
who
Eva.
are also two names that we have to shout out.
We
from
do.
that era.
Yes. As Anita was one of the first writers, as we begin to get into the early 90s, and suddenly, as Beverly will tell you, it sort of boomed. It was suddenly opened up, and you had all of these talented Black writers who were finally able to get their foot in the door. But Anita was able to get right away. Her books came out in hardcover.
Yeah.
She did a series. I think the first one was The Yellow Rose of Texas, which was wonderful. Her first book was self-published, and then it was picked up by a traditional house. But she got her books in the hardcover right away. And Eva Harlequin adored her. They literally, they just adored her. She was just such a lovely lady. But Eva also realized, when she tried to introduce Black books with Black characters, as much as they loved her, they weren't taking any books from her that had Black characters. But they were very good to her in terms of publishing. She liked being with them. She was steady. Yeah, Eva was wonderful.
Yeah, and
She and her little husband were just
Weren't they
adorable
cute?
together. Oh my God. And she was blind, right? So
She was blind. She was totally blind I think from birth.
yeah.
But anyway, yeah, they were devoted to each other. He was so supportive of what she was doing.
Yeah.
They were a lovely couple. They
Yeah,
were,
he was
talk about
definitely-
romance.
Right,
Yeah.
exactly. He was definitely a romance hero,
Right.
yeah,
You'd see him
Really.
at conferences and just go, oh.
I know. Very, very beloved couple. Very
Yeah.
beloved author. Yeah.
yeah, and I think it's interesting because Eva wrote Regency Romance #1 for Harlequin.
Yes.
So she was very much at the top of their list. Like,
Yes.
that's up there. Like, Sandra Brown starts lines, Nora Roberts starts lines.
Exactly.
Eva Rutland was right there, and that was,
Yeah.
I know, reading interviews with her, she said that Regencies were her first love.
Yes.
That she
Yeah.
loved writing those stories.
Yeah.
And then she kept going, and there were a number of titles she did that were plays on eyesight, which, knowing that she was blind,
Yes.
she clearly had a sense of humor about it.
About it. Yeah.
Yeah, but she wrote until she was in her 80s.
She
Yeah.
did. She did. And she did
Yeah.
get to a point, and, I don't know the circumstances, but at some point, Harlequin did not pick up and give her another contract, and she was in her 80s. And, things change. The industry was beginning to grow and evolve and change a little bit. And so I think she got to a point where they may not have felt that they could have sold her books. I don't know. She and I never had that conversation, but, it did happen. It did come into play.
Yeah. So I wanted to sort of come back to 1994, because, anyone who has followed me on social knows I talk about 1994 a lot, because it was this moment that was really astonishing. I have here, so Sandra,
Yes.
your book, Love Everlasting, was...
I did the cover.
Yeah, she
That's
painted
my
the
art.
cover, which is really
Yes.
beautiful.
Thank you.
So this was the last book published by Odyssey Books,
Right.
in February of '93.
Mhm.
Until Bev's book comes out it was June, correct? Was
Yeah,
it June or
July? Yeah,
one
June
of
or
those?
July.
It was one of
Yeah.
those. There were no other Black books that came out.
That's right.
After that, by the end of 1994, you
Right.
had something like 16 or 17 Black romances come out.
Right.
Really, this ginormous wave happens.
Well,
all at once.
the industry finally realized and that there was this whole audience of
Mhm.
Black readers, Black women who were reading these books, you know, and who were being ignored. So they were looking at it finally from a business perspective.
Right.
There was a whole area of potential consumer sales that they were missing out because they had so dug in their heels on the racial issue. But once they made the change, everybody benefited, the writers, the readers, the publishers as well. And Walter, bless him, who was a little bit ahead of the curve also, developed a whole line specifically for Black readers, the Arabesque line. Well, they it was Arabesque and Pinnacle.
It was
Forgot what
Pinnacle Arabesque, I think
Okay,
was the
thank you.
technical name of it.
Yeah, I
And
forgot
then
the
it
way
just
the-
became Arabesque shortly
Exactly.
after that.
which eventually was acquired by Harlequin.
Right.
Yeah. But yeah, so everyone began to jump on the bandwagon. But there was just a lot of new talent coming out there from about 1994 with Beverly in her book, and then all of these other writers. I mean, Shirley Hailstock,
Mhm.
Rochelle Allers, Ebony Snow, which was a pseudonym.
Yeah,
You know, Frances Ray. Yeah, there was just a bunch of them. Suddenly there they were. Yeah.
Yeah. And
It was the
actually, I
summer of
have
Black
here,
love.
these
sorry?
were,
Oh,
sorry, Bev, what did you say?
I was going to say the summer of Black love was
That's exactly what it became.
right. Yeah.
And I actually have here the first 3 books published by Pinnacle Arabesque, which
Right.
was Sandra, your book, Serenade.
Yes.
Yes, I do have the right book in my hand. Frances Ray, Forever Yours,
Right.
and Ebony Snow's Beguiled. And one of the things I think is really interesting, and I think speaks to the fact that Arabesque was kind of an experiment
Yeah.
for Kensington, is that
Yes.
you can see all 3 of these books are different lengths.
Yes.
But they were really like putting it out there, going, okay, what are people going to buy?
Yeah.
So it's really fascinating to have, Kensington, who is sort of the big independent.
Mhm.
You
And I
know,
think that was, one of the things about a lot of the Arabesque books is that they were not all cookie cutters. I mean, lengthwise,
Exactly.
they were all over the place.
Yeah.
Which,
Yeah.
The publishers, you have that, you gotta have, 384, you gotta have, you
Right.
didn't get that with
No.
Arabesque. But
Yeah.
readers talked about, at least with my book, and I'm sure with the other books too, that they went into the bookstores and they saw these books on the dumps. And the dumps are those cardboard things where they have
Right.
for the readers who don't know what a dump is.
Mhm.
And one woman said she looked at my book with that cover, Night Song. She said, I opened it to the back to see if it was really written by a Black woman. She said, and she sat on the floor in the bookstore right then and began to
read
read.
it. Yeah.
They were just so ecstatic because Black women were a large part of the romance population, even though there were no books that featured them on the page.
Yeah.
Mhm.
They
So,
were. It was huge.
for publishing, it was all about the money.
Yeah.
They were leaving money on the table,
Yeah.
and they finally figured it out.
Well,
So we
I
did.
remember that as we got into the late 80s and I was still writing a whole bunch of other things, but I was still largely published with Harlequin. And I began to see the way the readership was coming, particularly with the Black readers. And I'm thinking, holy crow, why doesn't Harlequin realize what they're sitting on? I mean, I was there.
Yeah.
And I'm waiting for them to say, Sandra, we're gonna expand and do some more of these books, and we're gonna bring in some more Black writers or whatever. They just did not get it. And they did not get it until after Walter came
Right.
out with Pinnacle Arabesque. And they just sort of missed a golden opportunity to
Yeah.
lead in the industry.
Racism made them stupid. You
Yeah.
know,
Yeah.
racism made them stupid. You know, you got all this money
Right.
waiting to go into your coffers.
Right.
You're so blind racially
Right.
that you don't even know what's out there. And if you do know what's out there, you don't want it. That's
Right.
crazy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's where it was so unfortunate. I mean, that, you know, it's just, it was so built in the system of racism, and no, you can't be part of that. No, you're not capable of doing that. I told you, they didn't think I was going to last past the 3 books. And,
Well,
you
yeah,
know, and I
Brenda
just kept,
knows.
I
Yeah.
just kept going and going.
Yeah.
And I remember one of the last editors who I really, really liked her. I'm still in touch with her, actually. She said to me once, she says, Harlequin is never, ever going to tell you this. She said, but during those years when you were writing for them, you were among their top 10 writers. Your books were selling that well. But of course, again, most of the subject matters in the book, characters were white.
Yeah.
And I remember going to an RWA conference. I can't remember what city I was in, but I was part of a panel. And after the panel was over and everybody is leaving the room, and those are the days, Beverly, you would remember when these conferences were so well attended. I mean, you had thousands of people there. And I left the panel room and I was going on my business to the next session. And there was this lady who was standing in the hallway against the wall, and she was just staring at me. And I smiled and said, hi. And she said, are you Sandra Kitt? And I said, yes, I am. And she said, I didn't know you were Black. And I said, is that supposed to make a difference? And she says, I love your stories. And I said, good. That's what I want to hear, is that the story resonated with you and you really enjoyed it. And so I'm very pleased to meet you. Thanks for, you know, tracking me down so that we can say hello to each other. But that was so telling. That was so, you know, so telling in those days.
Yeah.
The things that people didn't know, you know, those were the days before they put authors' pictures on the back of the books.
Yeah.
And Harlequin used to say, we don't promote or advertise any writer. Everybody gets the same kind of attention. Nonsense. Not true.
Yeah.
Not true.
Not true.
Yeah. Yeah. You know, and then those were also the days where you had a lot of editors in New York who didn't believe Black people could write romance.
Yes. Or that they read.
Right. Yeah. I had editors who, you know, Vivian had a whole stack of this kind of stuff that she saved, you know, and sent to me, and, you know, read this, read this, read this, where you had editors who said, number one, there would never be any Black historicals because, number one, we didn't have the history. And number two, we didn't have anybody who could write them.
Wow.
And Brenda Jackson will tell you the story of being in a conference and an editor saying to them, well, the reason that there aren't more Black writers is that you guys can't write. You know, and
how do they know that?
Yeah, we didn't know that, right? Yeah. So, you know, so to be able to step over that kind of ignorance and still be successful in spite of it.
Yeah.
You've been out here 40 years, I've been out here 30 years. Writing historicals, hello. You know?
Yes, exactly. I mean, I think it's a testimony to both of us and to all the other writers who eventually came along to prove them wrong. You know, you sort of felt like you were made to work so much harder than anybody else, you know, to prove them wrong, to prove that you could actually do this. But that's okay. I mean, I'm still here. You know, I'm still writing. Yeah.
We're all still writing. Brenda's a rainmaker now at Harlequin. You know, she's
yes,
she's
exactly.
still here. You know, so
yeah.
You know, and
but I do want to having you and I said all of this, I do want to bring Kelly back into the discussion because she had made the decision that one of her characters, the grandmother of one of her teenage protagonists, was going to be a writer. She wanted someone to be a writer, and it turned out that this woman was Black. But in what Beverly and I have related in terms of our history, the history of the industry, does any of it kind of strike a chord with you, like, oh my goodness, I didn't know that, or wow, that's interesting, I think I kind of touched on that a little bit. You know, how are you responding as a writer who
Hmm.
created this character, who was a pioneer, prototype pioneer? How does it all kind of resonate with you?
Many of the things that y'all are saying are, familiar from talking to other writers or from being a reader of romance for a long time, or from some of the research that I did. Uh, I honestly, Maryanne, in some ways, was the character that I felt she has a very small space in the novel, but was kind of where I put my heart
Oh,
in terms
yeah.
of how I wanted to not just organize the book, but to sort of see other characters in a way, in the same way that she would have seen them. And I kind of wish that I had space for her to have, just her own book.
Another book, another
Another book.
book. A
But
romance novel, a full romance novel.
right.
I for years have run a small press with my husband. I'm a bookstore owner. And so I feel like I have all these different windows into how publishing works, and sort of how writers, I guess how writers uh, find their ways into publishing, but also are shut out of publishing sometimes,
Mhm.
often, and how complicated careers can
Mhm.
be, and how hard it is to maintain a career over decades when publishing shifts so rapidly.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
And one of the things that I was, that I think about a great deal is, I came into reading through science fiction and fantasy. I began reading romance novels when I was in my 20s and I was in grad school. But it's been very clear to me over the decades that I worked in publishing that many of the largest changes in publishing begin in romance.
Yeah.
That romance really drives many of the large publishing changes, that in terms of opening up publishing to Black writers, to writers of color, in terms of genres, that what the last time I went to New York and sat down with people from my publisher, the word on everybody's mouth was romantasy. And I thought, well, this comes out of romance. And this is, again, publishing says, look at the audience for love stories in all kinds of genres. And there's money on the table, as y'all were saying, but also that there are people who want to write in these genres and combine these genres, and there are readers out there for love stories. And it sometimes astonishes me that publishing realizes this, and there's sort of a great wave of change, and then it's as if publishing forgets again.
You know, you're right, it does. And I was just thinking that, and I thought of this many, many years ago, that if you look at the trajectory of romance stories and the way they developed and how the changes come about, we were sort of, the genre is sort of the precursor to the changes happening in society.
Yeah.
They always come about first in our books.
Mhm.
And the way we're creating stories, and then the way the readers are responding to it. And then you begin to see some of those changes actually out there. The same thing happens in the film industry. But we look at the way RWA imploded about 5 years ago, when it became clear that what the organization was trying to do was to introduce stories from other people out there. And the other people were of a segment of society that members of the organization, by members, I mean mostly, they were readers, mostly not writers, just decided, well, let them have their own organization. We don't want RWA to go there and have gay stories or lesbian stories or LGBTQ, B2 plus. But again, it was to the writing organization, the writers, that began to push its way out of the confines of stories and publishing into the society at large.
Yeah.
And we've always been able to be kind of a touchstone for the changes that are happening or about to happen in society. The stories came first.
Yeah. We are the, I don't want to say the canary in the mine, but we are that, because if you look at romance now and you look at romance, the quote unquote formula that was there when we started, it is so different.
It is. Oh, yes.
So different. I mean, back then it was the heroines were white, they were size 6, they had blonde hair, they had blue eyes, and now you have all identities.
Yes.
Because love is love.
Yeah.
And you have people who are writing these all identity stories because there are people out there who are all identities who are looking for these stories.
Exactly.
And I love that in many ways, romance is starting to, or even leading, the demographics in this country. We're changing. The country is changing, all because of little romance novels, as people shame us, quote unquote, for writing what we do. But there's some powerful shit. It really is. It really is. So I'm trying to keep my mouth clean here.
Oh, that's all right.
We're with you. We got it.
Nobody cares. Nobody cares.
Right. Exactly. But yeah, when you look at the demographics of the country, between cross religion, cross racial mixtures and marriages, we're already into 3 or 4 generations of biracial citizens. And they're not just one biracial group, they're like multiple.
Right.
I read an article when I was doing research for the one of the books I just finished in my trilogy, and I was doing a research on biracial adults, children, whatever. And it's amazing when they were talking in this article about what their mixture was. It was like, well, on my father's side of the family, I'm Italian, Spanish, and Mexican, but my mother's side of the family is German and Swedish. And it's just going off the map. And I'm going, yay.
Yeah.
Because that to me, there's a lot of stories out there.
Yeah.
There are a lot of stories out there. And I, in particular, I'm very happy to see that bigger world view developing, because my stories are mostly they're all contemporary. And this is no knock against historicals. I just never was interested in doing historical novels about the past. I'm always focused on where we are now in society and the potential for the future. So that's going to be contemporary. But the country is changing every nanosecond because of the population and the demographics.
Yeah. All right, Steve, where we're going next?
Well, so this dovetails nicely. I wanted to pull us back to 1994 for a second and sort of talk about what it was like as authors, Bev as a new author and Sandra as now all of a sudden not one of the few, but one of the many, what it was like to have all of a sudden a sense of community, both with writers and with readers and things, because I know, you had Romance Slam Jam that started the next year, and, there was sort of a carve out, I think, for readers and writers. I wonder if you could maybe talk about that, what it was like in that moment to sort of all of a sudden find your people. Maybe Bev, you could start.
And they found us. I mean, they were looking for us. We were looking for them. One of the things that Vivian drilled into me was that treat your readers like gold. because they are your gold. They're paying your mortgage, they're paying your car note, and they will spread your work. You know, African Americans is in many ways is a word of mouth culture. You put it on the drum, and you know
Right.
it resonates in California, it resonates in Boston, it resonates in Florida. Because I can tell you that I feel like I am connected through these historicals to every Black woman in this country.
Right.
If
Yeah.
I need anything, all I have to do is throw up my hand, and somebody will say, "All right, Miss Bev, do this, do this, do this."
Right. Right.
A quick example: I wanted, when I did one of my contemporaries, and the soundtrack is Frankie Beverly and Mays, and I wanted to be able to get in touch with his people, just to see if I could maybe use, you know, some of the music. And so I reached out, and I'm a real good friend through these books with Regina Bell, the Grammy Award winner.
Yeah.
She reads my books. So I said, okay, Regina, how do I get in touch with? She said, I got you. She hooked me up with somebody who knew Frankie's then girlfriend, who knew Frankie's, you know, whatever. And next thing I know, I'm in my kitchen talking to his people. So they are, you know, and I always tell my readers, and I know they're probably sick of me saying this, or maybe not. But when I count my blessings, I count them twice, because I would not be here without them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Without the readers. Yeah.
Yeah.
I did the, you know, it's funny that you should mention the connection to Miss Bell, because I have a very good friend in California who used to work with Warner Brothers. And this is a man, and I met him because he was a reader of my books.
See, yeah.
And I had been out in LA for a conference, and one of the people at the conference said, "Oh, my husband works for this really neat guy who works at Warner Brothers, and he's been reading your books for years." So that's how I met CB. Oh, and he was a lighting technician at Warner Brothers, but he was on that film, The Bodyguard, that
Okay.
Whitney Houston did with Kevin Costner. And as a matter of fact, I have a picture taken of CB with Whitney in my living room. But those kinds of connections where people find you, your tribe finds you. And I said to him once, you know, I have an idea for Queen Latifah, because she started out as a singer, and then she became an actress. And I said, I have a perfect role for her where she gets to do both, you know, sing and do. So he says, "Oh, I can get you in touch with her." And I just went, you know, I just about fell off my chair. So I put my little package together. And and what happened was CB also knew Queen Latifah's hair, her beautician who does her hair.
Yeah.
So it was like this, you know, 6 degrees of separation. First I give it to CB, then he gives it to the hairstylist, and then the hairstylist, you know, it just keeps going like this. And it did get to her, but then nothing happened for years.
Yeah.
You know, and of course, you know, when you do something like that on your own, you just put your work out there, you're trying to make a connection. You always wonder if someone's going to walk away with your ideas.
Right.
That didn't, no, but you know, she's doing this show now called The Equalizer.
Right.
She doesn't sing in it. She's absolutely like a private detective kind of character. Yeah. And I'm going, sounds awfully close to the idea that I came up with for her. But you know, I got to let it go, because I'm never going to know where it developed. But the fact is, you know, she goes on and she does other things, and that's what happens. But yeah, Beverly, you know, you take a chance and reach out on your own and say, maybe I can get this into the hands of some. I've actually met Whoopi Goldberg and given her ideas for stories, and Morgan Freeman, and you know, so we're out there trying to just to be creative, you know.
So I want to move us forward, but there was one story that I think I've heard from both of you, and I don't remember if it was one of you or both of you, but at some point, it was, I want to say 1994, either one or both of you appeared on Geraldo.
Oh, that was
Oh.
me.
That was you. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Could
Yeah.
you just like maybe just give us a brief recap of that story? Because I find it fascinating.
Well, it happened because of Catherine Falk,
Yeah.
who was the publisher and founder of Romantic Times. And from my early days, before my first book was ever published, Catherine Falk championed me.
Yeah.
She made sure always that there was a place at the table for me.
Yeah.
She had my back. She got me involved in everything. And the producers for Geraldo had reached out to her because everyone knew who she was. And they wanted to do a panel and not a panel, but have some writers in the audience. And I think it was me, Patrice Small, Heather Graham. And again, you realize all of these are white except for me, because that was the era. Then, a lot of the Black writers hadn't come out yet. So we ended up on Geraldo, and, he was just asking about, the writing, and he wanted to know about the models, the male models on the covers of the books. It was very respectful and very nicely done. And we got, we had a face, we were on screen. So we had lots of people seeing us as writers. And of course, Catherine was also there. So that was just a very, very interesting experience. And because of that, then a few of us also ended up on the Phil Donahue show, because he was still doing that. And he same thing. He was very respectful. He wanted to know about what's this fascination with romance, and he wanted to know about Janet Daly, who at the time was one of Harlequin's premier writers. I mean, she went on to do 100 books for them. And so she was on the show also. They were using her as an example. Here is this woman who wrote all of these books and did so well. She has a huge audience and she's making money for Harlequin, and he's just going on and on and on. But he was making a point about it, because even from some of the comments in the audience or the phone-in comments, people were denigrating the genre.
Yeah.
And he was saying, yeah, but look how well they're doing. And, there's an audience and the books are selling. So it was that, those were the days when we were out there, and, we got a lot of coverage and a lot of play. And again, thanks to people like Catherine, I was there. I was
Yeah.
part of the opportunity.
Yeah. She was amazing because of her, I wound up on Sally Jesse Raphael.
Yes. Yeah.
Me and Tess Gerritsen.
Right.
Who else? There were 4 of us. She even brought in one of my readers. One of my white readers was from a little town in Nebraska. She flew her and her husband out. And she had the red glasses, and yeah,
Yeah.
Catherine was a very big supporter
Yes.
of early Black romance. And
Yes.
she and I were in a conversation once, and she said she was the one who elbowed Walter into starting Arabesque. She said it was my idea. I'm like, okay,
Okay. Yeah. Good.
but I could see that.
Yeah.
But
Yeah, Walter was very much in his experimental phase then.
Yeah.
They had older romance, they had male POV.
That's right.
After Arabesque, they started Encanto, which was bilingual.
Yes.
So, Walter, I think, deserves a lot of credit. And I think Catherine is someone that we don't talk about a lot as being so important in Black romance
Yeah.
she really
in those
was.
early days.
In the early
Yeah.
days, she was enormously supportive.
Yeah.
She was
Enormously.
she was
one of
the
my
first
biggest supporters.
Yeah.
Biggest
She was
supporters
one of the first ones to promote Odyssey books and Genesis books.
That's
Yeah.
They
right.
had this sort of running thing in the back of Romantic Times where you could order direct.
Right.
You
And
know,
she
she-
said that she gave a lot of help to Letitia.
Yeah.
Because Letitia, she decided to do her own publishing line when she realized she didn't know how to write. She said, I really wanted to write the books, she said, but I had no talent. So she decided she would publish them. But she reached out to Catherine, and Catherine spent a lot of time talking to her about the industry, and these are the people you need to know, and this is how you take care of your finances and your bookkeeping, and this is how you work with distributors for your book. So, you know, she was very helpful to Letitia.
Yeah, yeah. She was
I
amazing.
want. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Bev.
No, I was just going to say she was amazing. Just,
Yeah.
Yeah.
you know, Catherine was just an amazing woman and had her hand on the pulse of, you know, of romance and the readers. She gave the readers what they
Readers.
wanted.
Right.
You
the
know,
readers.
I will always remember the Mr. Romance
I
contest.
know.
Oh my God.
There are,
Moving
you know,
on, moving on.
for our audience, there are a few videos on YouTube of the Mr. Romance conference or contest, I think from New Orleans.
Oh Lord,
At some point, it's a hoot.
It is a hoot.
I wanted to bring in a few of our Q&A questions because they sort of
Okay.
tie to some of this
Yeah.
before we start talking about the future and what comes next. One of them, Sabrina asked, what sparked my interest in telling the story of Black romance and Black romance writers? You know, if you've been sitting here for the last hour and a half, I think you start to understand that there is so much here, and so much of it was undocumented.
Yeah.
And so, you know, I see my role as just pointing the spotlight in the right direction. So that's my short and sweet answer to that.
And we really, really appreciate you, Steve.
So
Absolutely.
Really, really do.
Absolutely.
Really do.
He
Yeah.
really knows. He's made a point of knowing and understanding the genre as a whole, but also the African American, you know, input into it. He's done a lot of work. He's done his homework.
Yeah.
I
And
do my
appreciate
best. You know, I am a librarian as well. So
Yes.
I
right.
got to research. When you give me a thing to research, I'm like a dog with a bone and got to get it. So, so Kathleen asks for both of you, Sandra and Bev, what at 30 years for you, Bev, and 40 years for you, Sandra, what keeps you writing at this point?
A lot of ideas, a lot of ideas. You know, I have an extensive background in art, so I tend to be very visually oriented. That means I'm always paying attention to what's going on around me, to people, settings. I eavesdrop on conversations. I get ideas from books that I've read, from incidences that I see, from movies. And I learned very, very early on to keep a notebook. And what I do is if something strikes me with the potential for a story, all I need to do is just write a sentence or two, just to remind me what was going through my mind. And then at some point later, I could go back to that notebook and begin kind of leafing through some of these ideas that I began to write down. And I know some of them will never get written, but that doesn't matter. The ideas are there. Sometimes I begin writing things that come to me instantly, and I know it's going to be a book. I know it's going to be a story. So that may jump ahead of the line of a lot of other things I've been keeping notes on. But what keeps me going is a love for the practice of writing, the practice of using language, using words, finding the right words to describe something. And really, you know, my favorite writing tool is my thesaurus, because I work really hard to make sure that the language is not the same all the time. I look for new words and new ways of saying things. So the whole idea of creating, of using the language to create stories, and being totally invested in my characters. You know, the Briggs-Myers test that people do to develop, you know, characters and all of that. I don't have to use it anymore, but I used to do that when I was creating characters. I'd have to, you know, we're playing literary gods. And we're creating these people out of soft clay, you know, and giving them, right? And giving them all kinds of three-dimensionality so that they're real. And once I really, really know and understand my characters, it makes it that much easier to write the story, because they talk to me. You know, at some point you sort of feel like, well, I thought I was going to be writing it this way, but he's telling me something else up here. It's magical. It's the whole process of writing has a certain kind of magic to it that I really, really love. And once I'm started on a book, all I really want to do is squirrel away somewhere and just write, just work on the story, work on the characters. That seems to be a built-in kind of thing for me at this point in my life, where I don't have to worry about, well, what am I going to write next? Or, what if I can't do it again? All of these kinds of doubts that may come filter in. No, as long as I'm writing, and I keep journals, so I'm always writing, even if it's not working on a book, I'm always writing.
I write because I have to. It's like that, what is that Oscar Wilde quote? I write to keep from going mad, and to paraphrase it. The characters are in my head. I have what I call my green room in my head where my characters reside, and they're in there, tapping their watches and tapping their foot and like, hurry up, my turn next, right? So but it's the whole creative process. It's a gift in my mind. And I write because at this point I'm not qualified to do anything else. I'm just 73-year-old lady who I got to do stories because I can't do nothing else right now. But and the connection to the readers, that also fuels the writing. So a brief quick answer.
So Lisa asked for Kelly, what has your first novel, The Book of Love? Who wrote The Book of Love? You did. What has this book taught you about love, do you think?
I think that when I am even in writing short stories, that one of the questions that helps me figure out who a character is not only thinking about who they love or what they love, but the way that they love somebody. And in the Book of Love, the difference is that I got to have a lot of more points of view. I had a lot more love stories going on. And so one of the ways through the book was thinking, well, these are very different people. They have very different kinds of relationships. They love in different ways. Their journeys are different. For some of one or two of the love stories in the Book of Love may only be kind of a temporary situation. It may be that this is an important love, but not a happily ever after. But it is nevertheless an important part of not just their life, but who they are. And so I think having all that space in a novel to sort of explore who somebody is through the question of how they love, how they express their love, all of that just felt. I hate writing. My relationship with writing is not a happy one. I love it, but I also hate it. I often feel very inadequate to the task. But to have all of that space to think about, as y'all were saying, characters who had come to me, characters that I was interested in, who felt as if they had stories that they wanted to tell, that having love is sort of the thing that taught me how to think about their stories, was hard work, but it felt very worth doing.
Yeah.
Thank you for that, Kelly. That was fantastic. We have one last question in the Q&A. It's from Jayashri Campbell, who recently did a great piece on the PBS NewsHour. Folks can go check that out. I think it was Valentine's week. But Jayashri wants to know from Sandra and Bev, is anyone still in touch with Catherine Falk? Because I know she sort of disappeared. And I don't know if anyone knows where she is at this point.
I'm assuming she's in Texas.
She had been down there because her father, and she has a brother who had some issues. But I don't know if she's still down there. And she also had a townhouse in Brooklyn. I had been in touch with her actually just even 6 months ago because her husband passed away,
Yeah.
10. And so she she got in touch with me to let me know that he had passed away. And so there was a little flurry of messages back and forth. And I said to her, well, if you do decide to do a memorial service or anything, let me know. Because he didn't have an integral part of Romantic Times, and that was her business.
Yeah.
But he had this extraordinary collection of pinball machines. And so so Catherine says, one of these days I'm going to have to put together an exhibit of all of Ken's pinball machines. But she discontinued the Romance Lovers Conference in 2018.
Yeah.
And she closed down the magazine the same year. And the last conference she had was that year in July or August, I believe, in Reno, Nevada. And do you remember Stacy?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Yeah.
So Stacy got in touch with me to let me know that Catherine had made this decision. And she says, I'd really like you to come out to the conference because I'd like you to give a kind of a testimony, to Vivian. And I said, I would be so honored to do that. I said, would absolutely be there. Now, it turned out that the day that they wanted me to speak at a luncheon was a day I could not get out of New York. I had professional commitments and I couldn't do it. So I wrote a testament and sent it out there, and they read it at the luncheon.
Okay.
But then I went out the next day. I was able to, follow through on the next day. And I spent a lot of time with Catherine and Ken at that moment. And one of the things that occurred, that weekend, one of the things that occurred to me was that, she's already done it. She's done it all. She
Yeah.
doesn't have to continue.
Nope.
And then there's that whole other issue of just simply aging.
Yeah.
Okay. And at this point, I don't know exactly how old she is, but I know she's in her 80s, her
Yeah.
early 80s. So, she knew when it was time to give it up, and she'd been doing it for 35 years.
Yeah.
So, so I did go out, and then I gave another testimony. I had to write another, another speech the next day. And I gave her full glorious props for what she had accomplished in the industry, what she had done for readers and fans in particular. Her conferences were always about them. And she fulfilled all of their fantasies with, the male model stuff and these incredible banquets and special parties. And it was just 3 or 4 days of conference every year that was just extraordinary fun.
Yeah.
And the readers really could be very hands-on and part of it. They weren't just an audience.
Yeah.
Things were developed for them to be part of it and have a full experience. And they did, and they loved it. She was very, very supportive of writers. And, if you needed something or assistance or help from her, she was there. She was there. So again, I was very happy to be asked to give a testimony about her. And then again, after the conference was over, I stayed in touch with her off and on. And Kate, remember Kate Ryan?
Yeah.
So these were all these little people who were her right hand, her left hand, who had her back and kept the whole complex or business and publication going.
Yeah.
She's still here. She is a lovely lady, very hard worker, huge sense of humor, and really, really understood the industry and knew what to give the readers. She was good. She's good.
I was, we were lucky enough. I was still at Bowling Green when the magazine shut down and the conference ended. We were lucky enough. Someone put Carol Stacy in touch with us.
Oh.
And Bowling Green ended up with all of the photo archives.
Oh, that was me.
Wow.
Was it you? Okay.
Yeah.
I know you had a big part in that.
Oh, I did, because they were going to throw them out.
Yeah,
Right.
and so a few months before the shutdown, we got about 50 bankers boxes full
Right.
of photographs and magazines and all kinds of stuff. That was really fantastic. And when I talk about Romantic Times and its impact, I call it the paper of record
Yeah,
for romance, because it really was.
it really
Everything
was.
happened
It
in
really
those
was.
pages.
Yes,
And
absolutely. Every aspect. Yeah.
and it feels like we really lost something when that went away.
Yeah.
I think we did, and we lost something when RWA kind of shut down. I don't think they're actually functioning anymore. But
Yeah, they
I
are.
do.
They
That-
are.
They are? Oh,
They're
okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
creeping
right.
Very,
along. Yeah.
very little. Yeah.
Okay. But I understand that things change. I understand that things have to change. RWA had been going for more than 30 years. Catherine had been going with Romantic Times for more than 30 years. And when Carol called me and told me that this was Catherine's decision, and she says, we have all of this stuff and we don't know what to do with it. She said, we think we're just going to have to just put it in the garbage. And I nearly had a heart attack. I said, no, please don't do that. And that was around the time, a few years after, Steve, that I had been in touch with Nancy Down.
Mhm.
And I said, I think I know a place where you can, send everything and they'll be happy to have it because of what it is and who it is that had put it all together. So
Yeah.
I was just the conduit. I just said, get in touch with this person here, there, and tell them what you've got. I'll send them an email and say, Catherine is extremely important to this history that you have in your special collection. And if you can take this stuff, you really should.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And really that photo record it was organized by author, so entirely by author name. And it's an incredible resource. And I
Yes.
hope that some of our researcher friends who are in the audience do get to check that out at some point, because it's really, if you're looking at anything really like pre-2000, because there's a shift to digital that makes things difficult, but all of that older stuff, there's so much in there and so much dirt. There's so
Yeah.
much, there's so much dirt in there that I never got to share as someone who had to deal with it on a day basis, because I had to maintain relationships. But there's a lot in there, so I hope that some of our researchers get to check that out.
Yeah.
I want to kind of look forward a little bit. Well, forward and backwards at the same time. We've talked a lot about publishers, about readers. Do you think that publishers, and I'm talking about sort of major publishers here, the big houses, have they really learned anything
No.
from the last 30, 40 years?
No, no.
No.
They, for an industry that does as well as they have managed to hold on to, they have remarkable lack of imagination, just an unbelievable lack of imagination and an inability to really look forward towards a trend or even create new ones on their own. There's a lot of rehashing. There's a lot of, they use this term in television and movies. Anyway, they can't seem to think ahead. So I don't think that in that regard much has changed, and they still fight any innovation that comes from the outside, such as
Yeah.
what happened, right, Bev, 5 years ago with RWA,
Yeah.
and which was
Yeah.
just a horrible set of circumstances and arguments and bad feelings that didn't have to happen.
Right.
Except that everyone's afraid of change. No one wants to admit that, oh, well, this is not going to last forever. It has to evolve into something different, into something new.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They're still using the same publishing model that they were using when Charles Dickens was selling his stories on a corner in London. They're still using the same procedures. So no. The only thing that's changed is the process. We're no longer typing and sending in books of 9,000 sheets of paper and lots of whiteout and all of that. But other than that, nah. And then I think and I hate to be generational, but I don't know if the youngins really get what or appreciate what they have.
I was going to
going through.
touch on that as well, and I completely agree with you. I mean, I think one of the observations I made at a festival I was at back in this early part of this year, was that we are at a point with the newer, younger generation and everything that's come in those years as well, the technology, the digitalization of everything, the short attention spans of readers. I think we're also at a point where, as genre women's fiction writers, I think we have to rethink what romance means to that other generation behind us, whether it's millennials or Generation Z. I look at, some of the books, or I talk to some of the people, and their idea of romance is really
Different.
Thank you. I couldn't have said it better myself. Yes, and I do think that if we're going to continue to write for this area, because hopefully love continues, love is, was always going to be part of the human condition and the human experience, that I think that as writers, we may have to think about how we would redefine what is romance and how we would write about that. And what do we think the reader's expectations are for relationships, for romance? I just think that
I just think they need to be okay. That was one of the things that people pushed for in the late years of RWA, was to reach out to the college kids and reach out to the high school kids so that they would be familiar with not just the tropes, but the way they're set up.
Yes.
And that never happened.
Yeah.
Which is, I think, why we have sort of the issues we have now. There was a young woman on Twitter, I refuse to call it X, Twitter yesterday, who was complaining because there were no list of tropes in her romance novel. She said, well, is this going to be, instead of reading the blurb,
instead of reading the book,
right, or the book, that was what a lot of people pointed out.
Yes,
we wanted to know why there was no, one bed, or why there was no marriage. She wanted to, honey, that's not how this works.
And that's not how writers write. Well, I can't say that. That's not true. Because there are identifiable tropes, and there's some of them that are popular and are repeated ad nauseum in a lot of the books, which I think it's kind of sad, because it does speak to I go back to a lack of imagination. Yeah. I mean, can't you think your way out of that or around it to something new?
Yeah.
And so that's all of what I mean about moving forward in terms of Steve's question, is that I think there has to be we have to give some more thought to it. I think that we have to do a little bit of redefinition. And I say we, I mean, because I'm thinking in terms of being a writer. Well, how do I write about this now from where we started and we knew what was happening in romances? Right now, I'm not sure. I'm not sure.
I think part of the issue too is, I don't think the publishing houses know what they're doing.
No,
in the sense of going forward either. So that adds to the whole craziness of, where are we? What are we doing? Who's leading the way? I'm not a big fan of, and people know this, I'm not a big fan of these little stick figure covers.
Oh my gosh. Oh, I'm so glad you said it and I didn't have to.
I am not a big fan of those. But, I'm just going to write. I'm going to continue to write what I write, how I write it. I know my readers will be there. And being 73 years old, I ain't going to be around here much longer anyway. So I'm just going to keep doing what I've been doing.
Don't play dead till you have to.
Oh, I know, Okay. I'm gonna dance with the folks that brung me, and and keep at it that way. So yeah.
Yeah. But I'm sure, just like Beverly, I do want to continue to write. I do have stories that I want to explore. And ultimately it's the only thing I can control is what I write.
Exactly.
So I
That's all
can't
you
let
can
myself,
control.
you can't let yourself get bent out of shape and go nuts trying to figure out
Right.
what the publishers are doing and what the industry is doing. And then this AI now, and I'm
Yeah.
thinking, oh my God, I mean,
Yeah, all of that is above my pay grade.
thank you. Thank you.
I'm just gonna
Right,
keep writing. So
Mhm.
yeah.
Yeah.
So I wonder if you guys could talk a little bit about how we've seen this sort of creeping area of censorship come in, because you both started writing in sort of more censorious times to begin with, right? Like where certain things were still taboo. Like, is there a way that you feel like it's starting to affect romance or affect how you all work?
It is affecting romances. Romances are being banned in many places, but
Wow.
they're also banning books on fry bread for kids.
Yes. Yeah.
So as the kids say, so unserious. I don't know. I can't write with that in mind.
That's the
I have
first
to
thing.
write
Yeah.
what I'm
Yeah.
going to write, the
Mhm.
way I'm going to write it,
Mhm.
and let people with, like I said, with a lot bigger money and a lot more pay grade, and
Yes.
do what I can do at the
Yeah.
local level.
Right. Right.
And
And that's
keep
all we can do. Clearly we both love to write. Clearly we appreciate the support and feedback from fans and readers, which is like life's blood to keep
Yeah.
you going. It keeps you encouraged. But all the other stuff happening, we don't have any control over. When I go back to the beginning of the industry, my beginning to it, I realized there were things that were happening that I couldn't be part of, that I could not control and I couldn't change. But there was a whole bunch of things that I was part of, that I was pulled into, that I was invited to be part of. So it was an interesting kind of balance.
Yeah.
There were a lot of things I wasn't allowed to do, but there were a hell of a lot of things that I was,
Yeah.
that were surprising and wonderful.
Yeah.
I consider that my trajectory through my career was incredibly fortunate,
Yeah.
considering I didn't start out to be a writer.
Mhm.
The fact that, I somehow did it, made it a career, a successful career with longevity and a couple of reinventions along the way. I feel very, very fortunate to have experienced and lived through all of that.
Fight
Absolutely.
your battles how you can, where you can, and where you are.
Yeah,
Yes,
exactly.
definitely.
Yeah.
I have one quick thought about that. Just because years ago, a friend of mine put together what she calls a career form for writers, for new writers. And it's sort of a list of questions that includes things like, what kind of relationship would you hope to have with your readers? What kind of genres do you want to work in? Are you interested in primarily, like, do you want to make a lot of money? Do you want critical acclaim? Do you want both of those? Do you want to work at your own pace? All of these questions. But it's also things like, what are you hoping to write this year and the next 5 years? And so it's a list of things that are not really under your control, but which you can sort of think about how to make it more likely. And then a list of things that are under your control, like, I'm going to write a couple of thousand words every week. And it's that balance between the things as a writer that you can do yourself versus the things that it depends on the way the world goes and how lucky you are, and some of the preparation that you do. And I think that is beginning to feel true for me too, about censorship and politics and the way that books
Yeah.
are seen in the world and certain kinds of stories
Mhm.
are censored. And I think not everybody is going to have the same amount of energy or time or the same sort of ability to exist in that space, which can be, I think, extremely traumatic. Some people are going to be thrust into it anyway.
Yeah.
But I think, including on that list, here's something that I could do, whether it is, shout outs to books, whether it's, organizing book drives, if it's having a little free library, if it's,
Oh, yeah.
all of that stuff, that there are small, and, if everybody does the amount of work towards making the world a place where everybody has access to stories that they need. Not everybody's going to do the same kind of work, but there probably are ways that at least because I have a bookstore, can think about what concrete steps am I going to take this year to support the things that I love and that I don't want to see censored.
Yeah, the whole censorship thing it's a tough nut right now, but what's even more disturbing about it is it's also coming along at a time when our literacy rate is way down. I know I live in New York, and they're monthly lamenting the fact that almost 50% of the kids in school are not even reading at grade level. Forget about reading enough to go past it. They're not even at grade level. So is that because they're not interested and they're sort of all like this with their little devices? Are they not interested in reading? Are they being encouraged to read? Is that a parental kind of thing that's not happening at home or classroom? And the whole thing about censorship also is very disturbing. What they've been discovering is that they're over right now almost 5,000 books just since the middle of last year that are on a censorship list. That's a lot of books.
Yeah.
But what's also been discovered is that the people who are objecting to the particular books hadn't actually read them.
Yeah.
I'm thinking, well, how do you counter that? How do you get around that? If you're talking parents, well, you can't interfere with what they do with their children, what they think they want to teach their children, or what they think the children want to read. Thank goodness for libraries. Thank goodness for bookstores in places where if you want to get it, you can get it. You can get it from Amazon. If you live in a community where censorship is so strong or has so strong a hold, there are ways for you to get a hold of reading material if you want. I think it's much harder if you're a kid or an adolescent in middle school, but by the time you get to high school, they've got it figured out. They know where they can go to get their reading material. But it's very demoralizing to think that there's this concerted effort to prevent people from reading, because reading educates you. Reading gives you knowledge, and that knowledge does give you significant power. What you don't know can hurt you.
Yeah.
So it's a big, it's a big problem.
Yeah. I don't know if you all realize this, but we have been talking for almost 2 hours.
Oh Lord, I need to start dinner. I need to start dinner.
Right. I need a drink. Right.
I think we could go another 4, but I wanted to maybe sort of lead us towards wrapping up. I wondered if each of you could sort of shout out a book and an author you've read recently or that you're excited about. Maybe start with you, Bev.
Oh, S.A. Cosby. Oh my God. I just did Blacktop Wasteland. I'm getting ready to take Razor Blade Tears on as my plane ride this weekend. I'm in the middle of a love song for Ricky Wilde by Tia Williams, which is fabulous also. So get you some S.A. Cosby. And I don't even read terror and suspense and all of that, but I love the way this man constructs the sentence. He is absolutely fabulous.
Yeah, sometimes just the language. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I am actually not reading fiction at the moment. When I'm between books, I take a break by reading nonfiction. And I'm actually reading a book that's called Coming of Age in Mississippi. And it was written during the 1960s by a young woman who grew up in poor rural Mississippi, but clearly was a very, very bright child, large family. Even as a teenager, when she was 11 and 12, she was working as a domestic in white households. But she found women who championed her and taught her and gave her advice, who were white and Black. And it was just it's a fascinating memoir of growing up and coming into your own, and coming of age and getting old enough to actually be able to go to college, and you widen your worldview because you finally leave home. So I'm about halfway through that. I'm just absolutely riveted because the writing is actually very good. It's not, it doesn't lament the bad things or the troubling things that happen in the family, in the household, and the community, anything. It's just a straightforward telling, this was what was going on in my life in Mississippi during these years. And so it's fascinating to me to read that. Coming of Age in Mississippi. Really enjoying it.
I just finished rereading a very long historical novel by the writer Nicola Griffith. The novel is Hild, and it is sort of a sweeping coming of age medieval novel about the woman who eventually becomes the abbess Hildegard of Bingen. And I'm reading it because I read the sequel, Meanwood, and loved that. And I thought, well, it's been so long since I read the first, I'll go back. And then I feel like for the last 2 years, I've been shouting out a book that I absolutely love, and I'll mention it here as well. A book by the writer Megan Giddings, The Women Could Fly, in which women can do, some women are witches. It's a contemporary novel set in the US. It sort of follows a woman who is biracial. She is hitting the point at which women discover whether or not they are witches. And if they are, there are a lot of rules and governmental regulations about how they can sort of exist in society. And it's just a really terrific, if I say it feels like a metaphor for the period that we're living through right now, it's a lot more than that. It's a fully realized novel, but I also felt like I was recognizing a lot of stuff about the particular moment where we are. It's called The Women Can Fly by Megan Giddings, and I've loved both of her novels, but I would start with this one.
Okay.
I already mentioned it, but I do want to again mention Kelly's The Book of Love, which is not a romance, but it has love stories. It is beautifully written. I mentioned to Kelly when I read it that it reminded me of some of the 90s work of authors like Clive Barker, that this sort of magic crossing into real life, and sort of horrible things happen, but wonderful things happen as well. So yeah, I'm just going to plug that one because I'm not in the middle of a book right now. So one last thing before we go, could you each plug whatever you are plugging right now? So whatever your current work is or what's coming next.
Book 12 of the Blessing series, the last one in the series. Lots of boohooing in my world, but sometimes you just got to step back. So,
well, I just finished a trilogy, and I happen to have here. Oh no, this is not even the right one. This was the first book in the trilogy, Winner Takes All. And I do have a copy of the third book, which will actually come out on April. Oh, thank you. Oh, thank you very much, Kelly.
I'm taking it on vacation with me tomorrow.
Okay, have a good vacation. Kelly has book 3 of the trilogy. The trilogy title is The Millionaires Club. And it's actually, the trilogy is about philanthropy and giving back and helping those who are less fortunate than ourselves. And so I'm very happy with that coming out. And it was, we were talking about our history and what we were doing in writing. And it was very interesting when I got asked to do this this trilogy with source books. They then asked me to make all 3 books diverse. So I had to come up with 3 different levels of diversity in 3 different books, 3 different settings, and a whole bunch of different characters, which I loved doing. But that's where I am right now. And then I think I'm going to cool my brain through the rest of the spring and summer, because I have a couple of ideas that are gelling, and I just need quiet space and time to let them do their thing in my head and see which one begins to come forward as the stronger possible project.
And I'm working on a middle grade novel. It's set in Western Massachusetts, and I will go on vacation. I'm going to read a lot of books, but I am also going to try and get through the rest of the middle grade that I've put aside for a few years now.
That is so exciting, because I know there have been some articles about this recently, that middle grade has sort of been suffering in a lot of ways. And as someone who volunteers in a school library, like, these kids are starving for their own sort of fantastical tales. So I think that's awesome.
Mhm.
All right. Well, thank you, all of you. This has been incredible. I always love talking with all 3 of you. I can't wait to do it again sometime. Billy, please make sure you drop the GoFundMe again in the chat so people can contribute if they're able. And yeah, thanks again.
Thank you,
Everybody.
Steve.
Thank
Good
you.
moderator.
Enjoy the
It
rest
was a
of your
dream
Friday.
come true. Thanks, Shaw.
Yes.
Thank you all so much. I'm so grateful to all of our panelists, to everyone in the audience who attended today. Everybody will get an email, fingers crossed, within the next week. It will have book lists and author names and resource links and more information than you can shake a stick at, and as well as a link to rewatch the video if there's something you missed. So thank you all again for attending. Thank you especially to all of our panelists, to Steve, to Ms. Bev, to Sandra, and to Kelly. Thank you, and have a great evening.
Thank you, Billy. Bye, everybody.